So yeah, let's get into the show. Eddie Joe, come on up. The world's greatest sandbagger of all time.
Greatest sandbagger of all time. Pretty good crowd here. Yeah, I have to thank Matt and again the American Alpine Club Fresno chapter and Crown and the Crow and Wolf for having all of us here and all you guys who showed up. I'm surprised. Even some faces I hadn't seen in a long time are here. That's great. And we'll have a question and answer period like after all three presentations if you can endure that long. So we'll save those things for the end. And I have to warn you guys that today's subject matter is about rock climbing, and if you aren't a climber, we're not going to be out here explaining how we got the ropes up there, okay? Or how we go to the, do those necessary things up there. You already know how to do that, okay? So we're not going to explain that. So don't fret if you aren't a climber, because the stories are really less about climbing and more about the people and the adventures that they have in the wilderness. And I'm here, I'm going to entertain you with this first segment with an excerpt out of my book, The Rites of Passage, The Legacy of Adventure Climbing in Sierra Nevada. And I have to tell everybody that this great photo of the east side of Morro Rock is by our local photographer and climber, Renee Ardesh. So if you have it's sort of an invisible side of Morro Rock, and it's quite colorful. It's pretty spectacular.
Show them where you're at.
Yeah, so there's a climber right there. So give you a little scope of the size of that wall. Okay. Okay, I do have some books for sale, so when I'm free from up here, if you guys get some feedback. So if you guys want one, I can sell you one. I have a few. Okay, so a few of you might want to know how my book came about. And when I started climbing in 1974, I read every book I could get my hands on about rock climbing. And my three favorite books were narratives about climbing. And they were The Games Climbers Play by Ken Wilson, The Vertical World of Yosemite, and High and Wild, and both of those were written by Galen Rowell. And those books were inspirational to me because of the adventures and the suspense, the fear, and the self-discovery laid out in written words and photographs. And I have to say photographs are real important. As I gained my own climbing experiences, I had my own stories to tell, which were shared over many a campfire. So I didn't start to document my climbing experiences until about 20 years ago, and I thought a book of stories like the ones I had read would be cool. And then about 10 years ago, I realized that a book of climbing experiences in the Southern Sierras couldn't just be mine. So I pitched the idea to those I thought might have a tale to tell, and everybody said, yeah, that's a great idea, but then everybody failed to put any stories in, right? It's just, I still have the receipts. I have all those emails, and I'm gonna come get you. No. So the pandemic finally came. Everybody lived through that. The lockdown, extended COVID leave from my job as doing everything at a public transit agency in the San Francisco Bay Area, came, and I took the time off. They offered it. So it was March, April, and May. Then I texted my coworker and I asked her, what absent code are you going to put on your time card? She says, I'm not going back, I'm retiring. And then my whole life at County Connection where I worked flashed before my eyes. I thought, oh, hell no. So if you guys aren't familiar with public agencies, they can be great places to work, but they're very unapologetic. They're unapologetic unapologetically guilty for resource abuse. So I knew that if I returned to duty, I would be assigned to her job and my job and whatever if I went back. So I said, I'm going to retire too. So besides all the unfinished and neglected projects at home spawned by too many hours at work, I had lots of time on my hands now, and the pandemic's nudge on my mortality created an urgency to get the book done. And to my surprise, I had several contributors on board eager to make it happen. It's like, wow. Well, that's me getting kicked under the bus. So the pandemic created some unique challenges for collaborating with others in person to do a book, which we didn't. Amazingly, we did this whole thing with phone calls, emails, text messages, snail mail, and interviews on a cell phone recording app that I had. And those were our contact tools, so that was pretty amazing when I think back about that. And I want to thank these people, and there's a whole lot more people that are involved with doing this. So Vitaly Mashenko, Linda Adams, Catherine Allison, Lee Allman, Ron Carson, David Hickey, Richard Leversey, Joe Metz, Dave Ost, Patrick Paul, Randy Powers, Chris Solon, Randy Steele, Brandon Thau, and Todd Vogel. And even people that don't have these entries in the book, like Greg Vernon here, he's done a real a lot of stuff in the Sierras, the First Ascents, so he's a very big contributor. So maybe volume 2, right? Yeah, that's his name. Yeah. Okay, see? So I failed to get a publisher to pick up the book, and the work is definitely a niche genre, obviously, and E.C. Joe is only known to the select few who personally can testify to my madness. So frustrated, I decided to self-publish the book, where the job of editing, layout, formatting, marketing would be up to me. The entire process was rife with more unique challenges than any client I've ever done. The rites of passage and legacy of adventure climbing in Sierra Nevada is a work that was decades in the making. The book is a tribute to everyone who aspires to adventure in the wilderness, to those who participate in making our legacy. Ultimately, this book is dedicated to a good friend and climbing partner, Richard Leversey. He had a contagious enthusiasm for climbing and for exploring the wilderness. He was the keystone to the development of rock climbing routes in the Southern Sierra. Richard passed while I had been finishing his book. If anything, he wanted not only to share our adventures, Richard wanted to inspire others to get out in the backcountry and have their own. And Richard would agree with me to encourage you to share those stories beyond an aspect ratio of 9:16, 4 gigs of data, 280 characters, or 90 seconds in length. Hey, no matter what your thing is, sport climbing, mountaineering, bouldering, trad climbing, big walls, cragging, or climbing in the gym, we all share the same DNA. We're all climbers. So write your stories and share them. So how about that? 1964 selfie. I didn't know what I was doing. Got the little brownie camera, got the poodle in the background. So growing up as a kid in the suburbs of Bakersfield, large doses of imaginative play had a role in developing that perspective. It was my parents who allowed me the freedom to find my path, despite their typical parental doubts about my judgment. In my parents' defense, I hold them inculpable of all the crazy stuff I had participated in as a kid that almost killed me in the process. Early on, I figured out that any endeavors that would substantiate their doubts were best not shared with them. Most parents would have never allowed their 16-year-old son to go on a 2-week backpack trip with 3 friends across the Sierra without adult supervision. Mine did. They must have had faith in my budding adolescent mountain sense. Nah, My folks didn't really understand what we were up to. My mom dropped us off at the trailhead above Lone Pine and said, "Have fun," and drove off down the road in a cloud of dust. The dust cleared, and that was the moment that we realized our freedom to wander and curate our own adventures. This set the stage for my exploratory rock climbing and the act of first ascents, which defined much, but not all, of climbing in the 1970s and 80s. The Southern Sierra had sat largely untouched by climbers until the 1970s, and any documentation of established technical routes was rare. You have to understand that what we were mostly doing, was a major contrast to what the majority of climbers do today. It was normal for us to invest all of our time walking out to the base of some unexplored cliff in the Sierra with no guarantee that we would climb first ascents on them. The majority of today's climbers consume climbs, which is basically to repeat climbs as described in guidebooks. I want to read to you an excerpt from called "The Pearl of Great Price" from my book, and I chose this because it feels to capture the vibe of the backcountry adventure. And I have a map here of the Kern River drainage. If you guys, any of you are familiar with it, you don't have to look, but we have like Porterville, and Bakersfield, sort of this main area, but the Kern Canyon is immense. It comes all the way down from Mount Whitney. So we have the Needles and around Johnsondale, Parker Bluff, and Dome Rock in between, and the Dome Lands over here east of Lake Isabella. So it wasn't long into my climbing experience that I learned the joy and excitement of seeking out the obscure. The southernmost end of the Sierra Nevada, near the South Fork of the Kern River, was suitable for such a quest, harboring a bounty of rock climbing spots rarely visited by humans. Its arid climatic environment allowed me to stretch my climbing season into the autumn through the spring months when the snow in the high country made it impassable or just too cold. There's nothing like catching the warm rays of the sun on a crisp winter day. You know the lizards were onto something, lazily basking on sunny rocks and cooling off with an occasional set of seemingly effortless push-ups. Some compared the Dome Lands to Joshua Tree National Park or even Swarming Meadows in the Sage. Like those areas, the variety of climbing is intriguing. In contrast, Dome Land is isolated and remote, factors making it potentially unforgiving. The areas within and adjacent to the Dome Land wilderness offer only the most committed climbers an endless playground. Some of the earliest ascents date back to probably the 1950s. Church Dome and its adjacent area have become quite popular due to its easy access from a road nearby. Indeed, this is the exception to the rule. Typically, most of these pearls of great price are guarded by long trudges into true wilderness, where one must seriously assess their risks. The risks were multiple. Where the hell are we? Will we find anything of note? Can we climb what we find? What if one of us gets injured? Or will we lose faith and flame out? Traveling there was not a big wall adventure in Yosemite or elsewhere. Instead, it was the antithesis. The rewards are significant for those who can put forth the effort to venture there. Steve Brower and I were no strangers to adversity. Being employed by the Department of Corrections, Steve supervised an inmate laundry, and I managed an inmate canteen. It was a world unkind to both our spirits. All it took was Steve, then a non-climber, to show interest in going climbing to create an escape catalyst from the angst of our jobs. Steve and I worked similar shifts, so we were able to sort our schedules simply enough. Since I was always keen on exploring new areas and rocks, especially with a willing partner, Steve's fate was unwittingly sealed before he even knew what fate awaited. sometimes being clueless is a good thing. During an early trial run, I set the hook. We had run out of water on our climb of a new route on Voodoo Dome at the Needles. It was not intentional, but once in motion, the hook came out. We slogged our parched asses and gear over to the Witch Sorcerer Notch. This is Voodoo Dome, and the Witch Sorcerer Notch is way over here. This is where I told Steve, "Hold on, man, I'll be right back." I returned with a rusty hulk that was once a large can of Del Monte sliced clean peaches in syrup that I had cached years before in the woods. Steve looked at the rusted can with its tattered and bleached label incredulously. "We can't eat that." "Don't worry, it'll be just like brand new." As I pulled out my P38 self-customized GI can opener with a 3/32 inch cable loop for securement on the vertical. What was that gold tinge light emitting from inside Marcellus Wallace's suitcase that Vincent Vega basked in? It had to have been an open can of sliced peaches. I peeled back that rusty lid to reveal a veritable pot of gold, just like new. Relieved, Steve couldn't contain himself. "Those were the best sliced peaches I've ever had. You saved my life." Steve had been metaphorically speaking, of course. Competent partners must be vigilant to protect each other from the risk and danger without flinching. Earlier the same day, I had gotten myself into a ridiculous situation of an imminent groundfall while forging that new route on Voodoo Dome. Having climbed circuitously above the first protection bolt with no alternative to reverse my moves, I had to continue to the next stamps to place another bolt. I could easily do the math. A fall before or at the next stance equaled me crashing to the ground, and I alerted Steve, who was belaying on the ground. "If I pitch off, you need to hold onto the rope and run downhill." This statement later made for excellent campfire fodder, a memory of our synchronistic experience. We jokingly named the route "Mama Told Me Not to Come." Hook, line, and sinker, Steve was ready for more in Domeland. The only available resources about Domeland at the time were random entries in climbing periodicals like Ascent, the American Alpine Club Journal, or token articles in magazines as off belay at Summit. And even then, one would have to be paying attention in the absence of Google search. Amazingly, from these usually ambiguous descriptions, we were able to find and climb numerous gems and establish a new significant climbs of our own.
No, I'll probably be there. I won't be there. Yeah, I have other people running.
Naturally, a reasonably benign magazine article, Climbing in Domeland Wilderness, sparked my interest on a new route established on Columbia Dome by the authors Dick Richardson and his partner Andy Solo. Their adventure was magnetic because they had spent some serious time in the wilderness to establish this technically difficult route. Initial explorations to new territory typically produce a route that is the most natural line or the easiest climb. However, this route did not fit that description. I was curious to see what was between the lines of the article. In the early 1980s, access to Domeland was allowed into the area via a few four-wheel drive roads. Roads through a wilderness area were perhaps the result of multi-agency jurisdiction and confusion between the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. In this case, it was good for us, since later they extended that wilderness boundary. Even so, we would still have a few miles of schlepping our water, food, climbing, and bivouac gear close to the dome as possible. We backpacked from around Trout Creek to the north of Columbia Dome, leaving Steve's truck behind. After taking advantage of fresh water from the Trout Creek, we meandered through the sparse pinyon pine and sage landscape to the south towards the dome. The journey was silent, save for our heavy breathing and rhythmic crunching of the granite soil under our feet. The pilgrimage of the backcountry climber can be full of doubts of the unknown. No guidebook, no beta, no Google, only a few cryptic and vague paragraphs. Near the dome, we ditched all but the essentials for climbing and made for our objective, which was called Kaopectate Blues. With a name like that, what could go wrong? And Kaopectate Blues goes up on this shoulder of Columbia Dome over here. Through climbing's lengthy history, anyone establishing a route somehow took license to name the climb, to catalog it into the minds of the climbing community. Guidebooks or to define it from other rivaling creations. Traditionally, most used lame monikers that merely depicted a route's position as the northwest face. Pretty boring. However, over time, choosing a more playful name, such as a popular song, state of mind, play of words, or to perhaps describe a feature of that particular climb, or something that represented a significant event during this ascent. As we were to discover, Kaopectate Blues was fortunately not named for the law. Once at the dome's base, a long prominent cracks system elegantly stood out and matched our vague description. Finding where the route went to get to the crack was difficult. I knew the first ascent team had climbed up the face and placed bolts for protection, but damn if I could spot any. The bolt hangers were challenging to see while looking directly at the face because of their color, a tarnished silver blended in with the surrounding rock. Then I remembered to use a little trickery. Standing with my face next to the slab, I scanned with a lizard's eye view. Bingo, I spotted one, then another, like little shark fins cutting the surface of the sea of stone. Wow, let's climb this thing. The initial phase climbing was mid-510s and the rock was friable. Beyond that was a long, tricky, and unprotected traverse on a quartz dike to a boat belay anchor. Handholds on this section were scant. It required precise footwork on the slimy dike. Carefully I advanced by crossing one foot around the other, performing a bizarre ballet on the stone. Once at the belay, I could see the glorious crack system on the next lead as it appeared to have no end. Steve had difficulty following the crumbling holes as he tried to rely on his hands too much instead of his feet. During his self-inflicted frustration, I adjusted several times, but he had pried off enough holds that the route probably went up a few grades in difficulty. Instead, Steve was able to pull up on each sling I had left in place. Once he grabbed the sling on the bolt above the dike, Steve was in flight. And without a sound, the bolt sheared off, and Steve, hardware and hanger in hand, fell in a wild 30-foot arc from a position almost level with me to hanging directly below the belay. Steve's face expressed sheer terror, akin to what we know now as the Hans Gruver Memorial Exit. Shaken but unscathed, Steve required lots of rope tension to get him up to the blank slab for belay. We were able to laugh about it afterwards, and like the rusty peach can, Steve had yet another souvenir to bring home. On a serious note, this was a grim reminder about the rumored bad batch of quarter-inch raw dry bolts manufactured in 1975, and they were out there, and I'm positive that was one of those. So while climbing the slab below had been punishing, the endless crack became our absolution. The price of entry was fierce, but now, past the threshold, we entered a world of unbelievable treasure. Wow. What lay before us was hundreds of feet of moderate finger-to-hand width-sized cracks on near-perfect granite. There was absolutely no other climb like it in the Southern Sierra. After each pitch, I'd sit there at the belay with a shit-eating grin, having enjoyed climbing every move. Leading, I relished it even more as I expended nearly every piece of gear on my climbing rack and barely had enough to set the belay. Our summit visits filled our minds with vistas of future places to explore. And for a moment in time, we were the masters of our universe. Steve and I swaggered our way back to our bivouac site, perhaps feeling as if we had won the pearl of great price. And maybe we had. The only thing for certain was that our journey to that moment was priceless. Thank you. And so our next presenter will be, where is that guy? He's over here. Rene Ardesh. Let me set him up here. The clicker's right here. I'm gonna get the